On August 14, 1847, plantation records from Beaufort District, South Carolina, documented an incident that officials would later attempt to erase from all historical archives. A woman standing 7 feet and 2 inches tall, purchased for the astronomical sum of $3,000, killed 6 overseers in a single night using nothing but the chains meant to restrain her. The Charleston Medical Journal briefly mentioned her autopsy before the entry was torn from every surviving copy, and 3 witnesses who testified at the subsequent inquiry disappeared within 18 months. For over a century, descendants of the families involved have refused to discuss what happened at Riverton Hall, but recently discovered letters and bills of sale reveal a story so disturbing that it challenges everything we understand about human endurance, calculated revenge, and the lengths people will go to preserve terrible secrets. Before we continue with the story of the woman known only as Tall Sarah in surviving documents, I want to ask you something. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the darkest corners of American history, the stories that were deliberately hidden, the truths too uncomfortable to acknowledge. If stories like this matter to you, hit that subscribe button right now. And I'm curious, where are you listening from? Drop your state or city in the comments below. Knowing where our audience is located helps us uncover more regional mysteries like this one. Now let's go back to Beaufort District in 1847, where something happened that would haunt an entire community for generations. The documents that survived tell us this much. She arrived in chains that had been specially forged in a Charleston ironworks, each linked twice the thickness of standard restraints. Beaufort District in 1847 occupied a peculiar position in South Carolina's rigid social hierarchy. The region's Sea Island cotton had made fortunes for families whose names appeared in Charleston society pages, yet these same families lived in perpetual anxiety about maintaining control over populations that outnumbered them 10 to 1. Riverton Hall, situated 7 miles inland from the coastal estates, belonged to the Grayson family, specifically to Marcus Grayson, a man whose reputation for efficiency and plantation management had earned him consultations from as far away as Mississippi. The Grayson plantation differed from its neighbors in one significant aspect. Marcus had inherited the property from his uncle in 1843 with instructions to modernize operations and maximize output. This meant experimentation with crop rotation, imported farming techniques from the Caribbean, and most controversially, a systematic approach to labor management that other planters whispered about at the Planters Hotel bar. Marcus kept meticulous records. He measured everything: hours worked, food consumed, punishment administered, even the exact dimensions of the quarters where the enslaved workers slept. His ledgers, preserved in the South Carolina Historical Society archives under restricted access, reveal a mind obsessed with control and optimization. Riverton Hall itself sprawled across 800 acres of prime cotton land, bordered on the east by the swampy tributaries of the Combahee River, and on the west by dense maritime forest that locals avoided after dark. The main house, a 2-story structure with Doric columns imported from Italy, stood on a slight rise overlooking the fields. Behind it, arranged with geometric precision, were the work buildings, the cotton house, the mill, the blacksmith forge, the overseer's quarters, and furthest back, barely visible from the main house, the 2 rows of slave cabins that housed 127 people as of January 1847. Marcus employed 4 overseers that year, each assigned specific sectors of the operation. The head overseer, a transplanted Virginian named Tobias Finch, had worked plantation security for 12 years and reportedly prided himself on never having lost a single enslaved person to escape. Under Finch served 3 younger men: Nathaniel Huxley from Georgia, Samuel Crenshaw from North Carolina, and a local man named Robert Vernon, whose family had worked Beaufort District land for 3 generations. Together, these 4 men maintained order through a combination of routine, surveillance, and calculated demonstrations of authority that Marcus termed preventative discipline in his correspondence. The system had functioned smoothly for 4 years. Then, In July 1847, Marcus received a letter from his factor in Charleston, a man named Edmund Lattimore, who specialized in unusual acquisitions. The letter, now preserved in the Grayson family papers at the University of South Carolina, described an opportunity that might interest a planter of Marcus's progressive inclinations. A woman of remarkable physical proportions and strength had become available through the estate sale of a deceased Virginia planter. She stood over 7 feet tall, possessed unusual musculature, and, according to the letter, had proven difficult to manage at her previous location. The Virginia estate wanted her gone quickly and quietly. The asking price, $3,000, more than triple the cost of a prime field hand. Marcus discussed the purchase with Finch over dinner on July 18th. The overseer's reaction, recorded in Marcus's journal, was cautious. Such a specimen might prove more trouble than profit, Finch reportedly said. Physical anomalies often correlate with mental deficiencies or unmanageable temperaments. But Marcus saw opportunity where Finch saw risk. A woman of such size could revolutionize field productivity. She could serve as an example of proper management, proof that Marcus's systematic approach could handle even the most challenging cases. On July 23rd, Marcus traveled to Charleston to inspect the woman personally. What he saw convinced him. She stood 7 feet and 2 inches tall, with a bone structure that the accompanying medical documentation described as congoid variant, exceptional density, estimated weight 240 to 260 pounds. Her shoulders were wider than most men's, her hands large enough to palm a man's skull. But what impressed Marcus most, according to his journal entry that night, was her eyes. Alert, calculating, possessed of an intelligence that suggested careful observation and retention of information. He purchased her on the spot, along with the specialized restraints that had been commissioned for her transport. The bill of sale, dated July 24, 1847, lists her simply as Sarah, age approximately 28 to 32 years, unusual height, Virginia-born, sold as is with no warranty of temperament. No surname, no family history, no record of her previous labor or the circumstances that had made the Virginia estate so eager to sell her. She arrived at Riverton Hall on August 3, 1847, transported in a reinforced wagon with sides that had been heightened to accommodate her frame. The chains that bound her wrists and ankles had been forged specifically for her dimensions. Each cuff 4 inches wide, each chain link thick as a man's thumb, the whole apparatus weighing approximately 40 pounds. Marcus had ordered additional security measures, a high-walled wagon bed, 2 armed guards riding alongside, and strict instructions that she was not to be released from restraints until proper accommodations had been prepared at Riverton Hall. The other enslaved people at Riverton Hall had heard rumors of her arrival for days. Word traveled through the quarters with the peculiar efficiency that Marcus never fully understood, despite his attempts to monitor and control information flow. By the time her wagon rolled into view, every person not actively working in the fields had found reasons to be within visual range of the main yard. What they saw disturbed them in ways that went beyond her physical size. One woman, called Dinah in the records, later testified that she looked at us like she was counting, like she was taking measure of something we couldn't see. Another, a man named Jupiter who worked the stables, said her face had no fear in it, and that scared me worse than if she'd been crying or fighting. She looked like she was waiting for something. Marcus had ordered the construction of a special holding area in one of the storage buildings. A room with reinforced door, barred window, and a floor-mounted ring where her chains could be secured. Finch objected to the location, arguing it was too close to the regular quarters, but Marcus insisted. He wanted the other enslaved people to see her, to witness proper management of even the most challenging case. It would serve, he believed, as both demonstration and deterrent. The first 3 days passed without incident. Sarah was fed twice daily, allowed limited movement within her secured room, and subjected to what Marcus called observational assessment. Finch and his men took turns watching her through the barred window, noting her behaviors, her responses to commands, her physical capabilities. Marcus visited personally each morning, accompanied by Dr. Samuel Pritchard, the local physician who maintained a side practice in plantation health management and had expressed scientific interest in examining someone of Sarah's unusual proportions. Dr. Pritchard's notes from those examinations, discovered in 1962 in the basement of a demolished Charleston Medical College, provide unsettling details. He measured her skull, her limbs, her bone density. He tested her strength by having her grip metal bars while he applied weight. He noted that her pulse remained steady even under stress, that her breathing never became labored, that she tolerated pain with a stoicism suggesting either unusual pain threshold or remarkable mental discipline. But what disturbed Pritchard most, based on his private journal entries, was her silence. She never spoke, never cried out during the examinations, never responded to questions in English or the limited French that Pritchard attempted. She simply watched, her eyes following every movement in the room, her expression neutral except for occasional moments when Pritchard swore he detected something calculating, almost mathematical, in the way she studied the door hinges and chain attachments. On the fourth day, August 7th, Marcus decided she was ready for integration into the work schedule. He instructed Finch to have her fitted with the standard work restraints, lighter chains that would allow field labor while preventing running, and assigned her to cotton picking under the supervision of Nathaniel Huxley, who oversaw the Western field crews. What happened next would become the subject of conflicting accounts in the testimony that followed. Huxley's version, given to the magistrate 2 weeks later, claimed that Sarah had attacked him without provocation when he attempted to adjust her chains. But testimony from 3 enslaved workers in that field, testimony obtained only because the investigating authorities needed to establish a timeline, told a different story. They described how Huxley had ordered Sarah to kneel for the chain adjustment, how she had complied without resistance, and how Huxley had then struck her across the face with his coiled whip, not as punishment for any infraction, but as what he called establishing proper understanding from the start. Sarah had not reacted, had not cried out or flinched or shown any sign that the blow had registered. She had simply continued kneeling, her eyes fixed on Huxley's face, her expression unchanged. This lack of reaction had apparently unnerved Huxley because he struck her again, harder, drawing blood from her lip. Still nothing. No sound, no movement, no emotion visible on her face. It was Huxley who had broken first. According to the testimony, he had stepped back, his own hand trembling slightly, and ordered her to stand and begin working. She had risen to her full height, towering over Huxley by more than a foot, and moved to the cotton rows without a word. For the rest of that day, she worked with mechanical efficiency, picking cotton at a rate that matched 3 normal workers, never slowing, never resting, her chains rattling rhythmically as she moved through the rows. That night, after the work crews had returned to their quarters and the evening meal had been distributed, Finch made a decision that would alter everything that followed. He instructed his 3 subordinate overseers to join him in conducting what he termed a comprehensive orientation session with Sarah. The stated purpose, recorded in Finch's daily log, was to establish clear behavioral expectations and demonstrate the consequences of resistance or non-compliance. The session was scheduled for 9 p.m. in Sarah's holding room, after the rest of the enslaved population had been locked in their quarters for the night. Marcus Grayson would later claim he had not been informed of this session in advance, though letters found in his desk drawer suggested otherwise. What is certain is that at approximately 8:45 p.m. on August 7, 1847, Finch, Huxley, Crenshaw, and Vernon gathered outside the storage building where Sarah was held, each man carrying the implements of their trade: whips, clubs, leather straps, and in Finch's case, a set of iron devices called thumb screws that were technically illegal in South Carolina, but widely used in private discipline sessions. 2 enslaved men, Jupiter from the stables and a man named Abraham who worked the cotton house, were ordered to stand guard outside the building with instructions to prevent anyone from approaching. Both men would later testify that they had been positioned deliberately out of direct sight of the holding room's barred window, but close enough to hear. What they heard over the next hour would haunt them for the rest of their lives, though they would struggle to put it into coherent narrative form. The session began, according to their testimony, with sounds of chains rattling, followed by Finch's voice giving commands. Then came sounds of impact, the crack of leather on flesh, the thud of wood on muscle, the metallic scrape of restraints being adjusted. But what disturbed both men most was the absence of the sounds they expected. No screams, no begging, no crying, nothing from Sarah. Just the rhythmic sounds of punishment being administered and, occasionally, one of the overseer's voices, though neither Jupiter nor Abraham could make out the words. This continued for approximately 40 minutes. Then the nature of the sounds changed. Abraham described it in his testimony as the chains starting to move different, faster, and the men's voices getting louder, not angry, but something else, something that made my stomach sick. Jupiter said the sounds reminded him of when you butcher a hog and it knows what's coming and starts thrashing. What both men agreed on was the exact moment everything changed. They heard Finch shout, "Hold her down," followed by a sound that Jupiter described as metal screaming, and Abraham called like a ship's anchor chain snapping in a storm. Then came the sounds of something heavy swinging through air, impact against flesh and bone, men's voices raised in genuine terror, and beneath it all, for the first time since arriving at Riverton Hall, Sarah made a sound. Not a scream or a cry, but a low, sustained vocalization that neither man could adequately describe, except to say it raised the hair on their arms and made them want to run despite the consequences. The chaos lasted perhaps 2 minutes. 2 minutes of impacts, breaking furniture, men shouting commands that went unheeded, and that terrible sustained sound from Sarah. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence that both men later said was somehow worse than the noise that had preceded it. Jupiter and Abraham stood frozen outside the building, neither willing to look through the window, neither willing to approach the door, both paralyzed by the implications of what they had heard and what that silence might mean. They stood there for perhaps 5 minutes, though both admitted time became elastic in those moments, before the door opened from inside. Sarah emerged, still chained but now holding approximately 6 feet of loose chain in her hands, the end links dripping something dark that reflected the moonlight. She was breathing heavily, the first time either man had seen her show any physical exertion, and her prison dress was torn and stained. She looked at both men with an expression that Abraham later struggled to describe. Not angry, not scared, just empty, like something had gone out of her and left something else behind. She walked past them without speaking, moving toward the main path that led through the plantation grounds. Her gait was measured, purposeful, and despite the 40 pounds of chains she still wore, she moved with a fluidity that seemed to contradict her size. Jupiter and Abraham watched her go, neither man moving to stop her, neither willing to look through that open door to see what she had left behind. It was Abraham who finally found the courage to approach the doorway and peer inside, though he would later say this was the worst decision of his life. The holding room, which measured approximately 12 feet by 15 feet, looked as though something massive and violent had occurred in a very confined space. The floor-mounted ring where Sarah's chains had been secured had been torn completely free from the floorboards, the surrounding wood splintered upward. Furniture that had been in the room, a small table, 2 chairs, had been reduced to fragments scattered across the floor. And there, in various positions around the room, were Finch, Huxley, Crenshaw, and Vernon. Abraham did not enter the room, did not need to. Even from the doorway, even in the limited light from the single oil lamp that had somehow remained lit through whatever had transpired, he could see enough to know that all 4 men were dead. The specific nature of their injuries would be documented later by Dr. Pritchard and the examining magistrate, But Abraham noted only that they looked like they'd been hit by something heavier than any human should be able to swing, and hit more times than you could count. He backed away from the door, turned to Jupiter, and said simply, "We need to wake Mr. Grayson." But Sarah was not running. Instead, she was walking methodically through the plantation grounds, following the main path toward the quarters where the other enslaved people were locked for the night. Several people, awakened by the sounds of the earlier disturbance, watched from their cabin windows as she passed. One woman, called Rachel in the records, later testified that Sarah moved like she had somewhere specific to go, like she was walking toward something she'd planned for a long time. Sarah stopped at the quarters building that housed the plantation's blacksmith forge and workspace. The door was locked, but this proved no obstacle. Using the chain still attached to her wrist cuffs, she broke the lock with 3 measured strikes and entered the building. People watching from nearby cabins could see her silhouette moving in the darkness, hear the sounds of metal on metal, see occasional sparks from the forge area. She remained inside for approximately 15 minutes. When she emerged, the chains that had bound her wrists and ankles were gone. In their place, she carried tools, a hammer, a chisel, something that looked like a pry bar. And she was walking toward the storage building that served as the plantation's secure facility for holding problematic enslaved people awaiting sale or transfer to harsher labor conditions. This building, constructed of heavy timbers with a reinforced door and no windows, held 3 people that night. 2 men who had attempted to run the previous month, and a woman who had fought with an overseer. Sarah approached the door and, using the tools she had taken from the forge, began dismantling the lock mechanism. It took her perhaps 5 minutes. 5 minutes during which more and more people in the quarters awakened and watched from their windows, no one quite understanding what they were witnessing, but all sensing that something fundamental had shifted in the power dynamics that governed their lives. When the door opened, the 3 prisoners emerged, blinking in the moonlight. Sarah did not speak to them, did not acknowledge them beyond a gesture toward the woods that bordered the western edge of the plantation. They stood frozen for a moment, clearly terrified of the consequences of accepting what she was offering. Then all 3 ran for the tree line and disappeared into the darkness. Sarah did not follow them. Instead, she turned and began walking toward the main house. By this time, approximately 30 minutes after Abraham had discovered the bodies in the holding room, Marcus Grayson had been awakened and had sent riders to fetch the magistrate and Dr. Pritchard. But before any authority could arrive, while Marcus barricaded himself in his house with his wife and 3 children and his loaded hunting rifle, Sarah reached the front steps of Riverton Hall's main residence. She did not attempt to enter, did not make threats or demands. Instead, according to testimony from enslaved people who witnessed the scene from various vantage points around the plantation grounds, she stood at the base of the steps, her 7-foot frame clearly visible in the light of the house's front lamps, and simply waited, watching the door with that same neutral expression that had disturbed so many people during her brief time at Riverton Hall. She stood there for 2 hours unmoving as riders galloped away into the darkness to summon help. She stood there as the other enslaved people, realizing they were not being restrained or punished for watching, gradually emerged from their quarters and formed a loose semicircle behind her, not joining her but not opposing her either, simply bearing witness to something none of them had words to describe. She stood there as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, and the true scope of what had happened began to reveal itself in the growing light. When the magistrate finally arrived at first light, accompanied by 6 armed men and Dr. Pritchard, they found Sarah still standing at the base of the main house steps, surrounded now by more than 70 enslaved people who had gathered through the night, all of them silent, all of them watching. The magistrate later described the scene in his official report as disturbing in its implications and organized appearance, suggesting premeditation rather than spontaneous uprising. Sarah offered no resistance when the armed men approached her with reinforced restraints. She allowed herself to be chained, new chains heavier than before that required 3 men to carry, and led away to a wagon that had been specially prepared for transport. She looked back only once as they moved her toward the wagon, her gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd of enslaved people, and several witnesses later testified that in that moment they saw something in her expression that they couldn't quite name. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but perhaps acknowledgement of something completed or begun. The wagon departed Riverton Hall at approximately 7 a.m. on August 8, 1847, carrying Sarah toward Charleston and whatever fate awaited her in the legal proceedings that would follow. Behind her, the plantation descended into controlled chaos as authorities began the grim work of documenting the scene in the holding room, taking testimony, and attempting to establish a clear sequence of events that would make sense of what had transpired in those dark hours. The immediate aftermath of August 7th-8th sent shockwaves through Beaufort District's planter class that extended far beyond the deaths of 4 overseers. Within days, Marcus Grayson found himself defending not just his decision to purchase Sarah, but his entire approach to plantation management before a hastily convened inquiry of neighboring planters and district magistrates. The proceedings, held at the Beaufort County Courthouse from August 12th through August 18th, generated hundreds of pages of testimony that revealed uncomfortable truths about the methods employed at Riverton Hall and similar operations throughout the region. Dr. Pritchard's medical examination of the 4 dead overseers, conducted on August 8th and documented in excruciating detail in his official report, established facts that made the entire planter community deeply uneasy. All 4 men had died from blunt force trauma, consistent with being struck repeatedly by something heavy and metallic, specifically the chains that had bound Sarah's wrists and ankles. The pattern and distribution of injuries suggested, according to Pritchard's professional opinion, a methodical rather than frenzied attack, with strikes targeted to produce maximum incapacitation. More disturbingly, the examination of the men's clothing and the holding room itself revealed evidence that contradicted the official narrative of unprovoked assault. Pritchard's private journal, not discovered until decades later, went further. He noted that all 4 men showed signs of recent exertion, consistent with sustained physical activity of a strenuous nature, that their hands bore marks suggesting gripping and restraining actions, and that the arrangement of the bodies in the room indicated a sequence of events more complex than simple defensive action by the deceased. He concluded in notes he clearly never intended for official publication that the physical evidence suggests the deceased engaged in coordinated action against the prisoner prior to her defensive response, and that this action was sustained for a period of time sufficient to provoke extreme reaction. These observations were not included in Pritchard's official report to the inquiry. Years later, in a letter to a colleague dated 1853, he would explain this omission. To have detailed the full implications of my findings would have opened questions that the district's planter class was not prepared to address regarding the methods employed in the management of human property. The social order depended on certain truths remaining unexamined. The inquiry itself focused less on the deaths of the 4 overseers, which were quickly framed as tragic casualties of an inherently dangerous profession, and more on the broader question of Sarah's legal status and ultimate fate. South Carolina law in 1847 provided clear guidelines for enslaved people who killed white persons. Mandatory execution, typically by hanging, to be carried out publicly as a deterrent. But Sarah's case presented complications that made simple application of these laws politically difficult. First, there was the matter of witness testimony. The inquiry heard from Jupiter and Abraham, who described what they had heard but not seen, and this testimony raised uncomfortable questions about what had been happening in that holding room before the chains broke. Several magistrates suggested that if the overseers had been engaged in activities that exceeded legitimate discipline, and the evidence strongly suggested they had, then the legal status of Sarah's actions became murkier. Under South Carolina law, even enslaved people retained limited rights to self-defense against illegal violence, though this principle had rarely been invoked. Second, there was the economic consideration. Marcus Grayson had paid $3,000 for Sarah, a sum that represented a significant investment and one that would be completely lost if she were executed. Grayson argued through his attorney that the deaths had resulted from inadequate restraint procedures rather than inherent viciousness in Sarah, and that with proper management she could still provide valuable labor. Several other planters, already concerned about the financial implications of the case for their own operations, supported this view. Third, and most troubling from the inquiry's perspective, there was the reaction of the enslaved population. In the week following the incident, not a single escape attempt had been reported from Riverton Hall, unusual given the chaos and reduced supervision. But the enslaved people had not returned to normal work rhythms either. They moved through their assigned tasks with mechanical efficiency, but without the small gestures of accommodation and deference that usually characterize the plantation's daily operations. Several overseers from neighboring plantations reported similar changes in their own enslaved population's behavior, as word of Sarah's actions spread through the communication networks that planters never fully understood or controlled. The inquiry concluded on August 18th with a compromise verdict that satisfied no one but avoided the worst political and economic consequences for all involved parties. Sarah would not be executed immediately, but would be held in secure custody pending further evaluation of her mental state and capacity for rehabilitation. Marcus Grayson would forfeit his investment. Sarah would be considered property of the state, but would not face charges related to inadequate supervision or the deaths of his overseers. The families of the 4 dead men would receive compensation from a fund established by collective contribution from district planters. And the specific details of what had occurred in the holding room would be classified as sensitive to ongoing security considerations and excluded from public court records. Sarah herself had been present for only one day of the inquiry proceedings, August 13th, when the magistrates insisted on viewing her personally to assess her mental state and physical condition. She was transported from the Charleston jail, where she had been held in a specially reinforced cell, and brought into the courthouse under heavy guard. Contemporary newspaper accounts from the Charleston Mercury and the Beaufort Republican describe the scene with language that reveals the deep unease her presence generated. The woman stood before the assembled magistrates with neither defiance nor submission visible in her bearing, wrote the Mercury's correspondent. She is of truly remarkable proportions, and her silence throughout the questioning, she would not or could not speak, even when directly addressed, created an atmosphere of profound disquiet in the chamber. Several gentlemen present remarked afterward that they had never encountered a human presence so unsettling in its opacity, as though one were looking at a door behind which terrible knowledge resided but could not be accessed. Dr. Pritchard, called upon to offer professional assessment of Sarah's mental condition, provided testimony that carefully avoided any conclusion that might force immediate execution. He described her as mentally sound but selectively mute, possibly as a result of trauma experienced prior to arrival in this district. He noted that her physical examination showed evidence of extensive scarring consistent with chronic punishment or restraint over a period of years, and that her skeletal structure suggests either genetic anomaly or early childhood exposure to conditions promoting unusual growth. What Pritchard did not include in his official testimony, but recorded in his journal, was his private conviction that Sarah was not incapable of speech, but rather choosing silence as a form of control, that she understood everything said around her and was making calculated decisions about when and whether to respond. During his examination, he had attempted several tactics to provoke verbal response, including sudden sharp pain stimuli and unexpected questions. In each case, Sarah had maintained her silence, while her eyes tracked his movements with what he described as disconcerting precision and apparent analytical interest in my methods. Following the inquiry's conclusion, Sarah was returned to Charleston and housed in a secure facility normally used for enslaved people awaiting sale or transport. The city's magistrates faced a difficult question: what to do with a person who could not be legally executed without reopening uncomfortable questions but who could not be returned to private ownership given the liability she represented. The solution they arrived at would prove influential in shaping her fate for the next 3 years. Sarah was designated as state property pending assignment to appropriate secure labor. In practical terms, this meant she could be leased to government projects that required heavy labor, but could maintain the specialized security measures her case seemed to demand. Over the next 3 years, she was moved among several such assignments. A stone quarry outside Columbia, a rice processing facility near Georgetown, a railroad construction project in the interior, and briefly, a state-owned mining operation in the upcountry. Records from these various assignments are fragmentary and often contradictory, but certain patterns emerge from the surviving documentation. Sarah consistently performed labor at rates that exceeded normal expectations. One foreman at the railroad project estimated she accomplished in 8 hours what would normally require 12 to 16 hours from a standard work crew. She maintained her silence, except for rare instances when direct communication became necessary for safety or coordination, at which point she would speak in monosyllables, her voice described as surprisingly soft for her size, with accent suggesting Virginia or Maryland origin. More significantly, every facility that held Sarah implemented progressively more elaborate security measures after initial incidents suggested she was both extremely strong and alarmingly methodical in observing her surroundings. At the stone quarry, she was discovered to have loosened the bolts holding her chain-mounting ring over a period of weeks, not attempting escape, but apparently testing the construction. At the rice facility, she was found to have created a detailed mental map of the building's layout and routine, which only became apparent when she helped coordinate response to a fire in a manner suggesting she had planned multiple scenarios in advance. At the railroad site, workers reported that she studied the construction techniques used on bridges and trestles with an intensity that made supervisors uncomfortable, though she never attempted sabotage or escape. Each incident led to tighter restrictions, heavier chains, more frequent inspections. Yet Sarah adapted to each new security measure with what observers consistently described as unsettling patience, as though she was simply gathering information about increasingly sophisticated containment systems without any immediate intention to test them. In Charleston, meanwhile, the long-term impact of the Riverton Hall incident continued to ripple through the district's social structure. Marcus Grayson, financially damaged by the loss of his investment and socially tainted by association with the disaster, sold Riverton Hall in 1849 and moved his family to Alabama, where he attempted to rebuild his reputation. The plantation passed through 2 owners in rapid succession, before being purchased in 1851 by a consortium that converted it primarily to rice cultivation and implemented management practices that deliberately contrasted with Grayson's systematic approach. Whether this represented genuine reformation or merely more careful concealment of similar practices remained debated among the enslaved commune. 90. The 4 dead overseers became something of a cautionary tale in certain circles, used by some to argue for more careful selection and training of plantation security personnel, and by others as evidence that certain management practices, however effective in the short term, carried unsustainable risks. Finch's widow received the largest portion of the compensation fund and used it to relocate to her family's home in Virginia. The families of Huxley, Crenshaw, and Vernon remained in Beaufort District, though they avoided discussing the incident in specific terms, referring to it obliquely as the trouble at Grayson's place in the rare instances when it came up in conversation. Among the enslaved community throughout the region, Sarah became something more complicated than a simple folk hero. Stories circulated about her, some accurate, many embellished or entirely invented, but the tone of these stories varied considerably, depending on who told them and in what context. Some people spoke of her with something like awe, as someone who had done what most could only imagine. Others expressed deep ambivalence, noting that her actions had led to increased security measures and heightened suspicion throughout the district, making everyone's daily life more difficult and constrained. Still others saw her as a cautionary tale about the cost of resistance. noting that despite killing 4 overseers, she remained in bondage and in conditions far harsher than most enslaved people endured. The 3 people Sarah had freed from the punishment building on that August night in 1847, 2 men and a woman, all successfully reached free territory, according to later accounts that filtered back through the Underground Railroad network. Their testimonies, recorded years later in Canada and Ohio, provided some of the most detailed descriptions of Sarah's physical presence and demeanor. All 3 emphasized her silence and the sense of inevitability she seemed to carry, as though she were acting out a sequence she had planned long in advance. One man described her as, like watching a storm approach. You knew something powerful was coming, but you couldn't stop it or understand it, only witness it. In 1850, a medical journal published a brief article titled Observations on Physical Anomalies in the Negro Race, authored anonymously but clearly based on Dr. Pritchard's examination of Sarah. The article, which claimed to describe several cases of unusual physical development, devoted 3 paragraphs to a woman of exceptional height and bone density examined in coastal South Carolina, and speculated about the hereditary and environmental factors that might produce such variation. The article drew criticism from some medical colleagues who questioned whether it was appropriate to publish findings that might be used to support theories about racial classification and hierarchy. The journal's editor defended the publication on scientific grounds, but agreed to withhold the specific name and location of the subject to protect sensitive parties involved. It was this article that brought Sarah's case to the attention of Dr. Franklin Lowell Hayes, a physician and anatomist based in Augusta, Georgia, who had developed a particular interest in what he termed physiological extremes within enslaved populations. Hayes had published several papers arguing that such extremes represented valuable data for understanding human variation, and that the enslaved population provided an unprecedented opportunity for systematic study that should not be wasted. His interest in Sarah was not humanitarian, but scientific. He saw her as a potentially unique specimen whose anatomical structure might reveal principles applicable to broader theories about race, development, and human capability. In early 1851, Hayes wrote to the South Carolina authorities proposing that Sarah be transferred to his facility in Augusta for comprehensive medical study. His letter, preserved in the South Carolina Department of Archives and History, outlined an elaborate plan for systematic investigation of her physical and mental capacities under controlled conditions, with the results to be published in medical literature and potentially presented at the upcoming conference of the American Medical Association. He offered to assume all costs of her maintenance during the study period and suggested that the findings might have practical applications for plantation management and labor optimization. The proposal generated considerable debate among state officials. Some saw merit in Hayes's scientific arguments and appreciated that his offer would relieve the state of the ongoing cost and security concerns associated with holding Sarah. Others questioned whether the study would simply provide opportunity for Hayes to profit from publication while exposing South Carolina to renewed attention regarding an incident most preferred to forget. The enslaved community, to the extent that word of the proposal reached them through the various informal networks of communication, reacted with deep suspicion, seeing in Hayes's plans something more sinister than simple scientific inquiry. The decision regarding Hayes's proposal was still under consideration when an event occurred that forced the issue and ultimately determined Sarah's fate. On the night of March 17, 1851, at the state-owned mining operation near Newberry, where Sarah had been assigned for the previous 4 months, something happened that would never be fully explained, despite extensive investigation and multiple inquiries over the subsequent months. The Newberry mining facility operated extracting iron ore, employing approximately 40 enslaved workers. Sarah had been assigned to hauling ore, work that utilized her exceptional strength while keeping her above ground where she could be monitored. The night guard, Thomas Rutledge, reported hearing unusual sounds around 2 a.m. coming from the mine entrance. He found Sarah standing there despite being locked in quarters, her chains removed though she still wore the cuffs. She held a sledgehammer and had been striking the main support beam across the mine entrance. Rutledge raised his rifle and ordered her to drop the hammer. Sarah turned to look at him with what he described as perfect calm despite the rifle pointed at her. She set down the hammer and walked toward him slowly. When he shouted for her to stop, she did, 20 feet away, and spoke in complete sentences for the first time in anyone's documented experience. "That support beam is cracked," she said in educated English with a Virginia accent. "The mine will collapse. Everyone working inside come morning will die. I was trying to mark it so you'd see." When other guards arrived, the supervisor, Gerard Kinsmore, examined the beam and found a significant crack that would likely have caused catastrophic collapse during the next day's operations. Sarah had potentially saved multiple lives, but she had also escaped her restraints and taken tools without permission, actions that normally merited severe punishment. Investigation revealed disturbing facts. Sarah had been systematically weakening her restraint mechanism over weeks through patient manipulation of bolt threads. Mine workers reported she had been speaking occasionally with them, asking detailed questions about mining operations and structural engineering. One worker said Sarah had spent an entire meal asking about ore cart pulley systems, like she was trying to learn how to build one herself. These revelations shattered the narrative that Sarah was mentally deficient. She was highly intelligent, observant, and capable of long-term planning. State authorities faced an impossible choice: punish her for the violation while she'd prevented disaster, transfer her to even higher security, or accept Dr. Hayes's proposal and make her someone else's problem. In late April 1851, they chose the latter. Sarah was transferred to Hayes's custody in Augusta under strict conditions. Hayes would assume full responsibility for her security and provide regular reports to South Carolina authorities. Hayes's facility was a converted warehouse fitted with reinforced cells and examination rooms. Over nearly 3 years, Hayes conducted what he termed comprehensive study of Sarah's physical and mental characteristics. His methods, documented in journals discovered after his 1874 death, would be considered unethical by any standard. He subjected Sarah to batteries of physical tests, invasive anatomical measurements, psychological manipulations, and extended periods of isolation, all ostensibly for scientific documentation. Through it all, Sarah maintained her pattern: silence except when speech served a purpose, compliance with physical procedures but resistance to psychological manipulation, and constant observation of everything around her. Hayes grew increasingly frustrated with what he called the subject's refusal to provide spontaneous responses. He noted that Sarah seemed to study him as intently as he studied her, adapting her behavior to minimize invasive procedures. In September 1852, Hayes designed an experiment with mechanical puzzles that needed solving in sequence to unlock a door. Sarah solved them in half his estimated time, but then she spent additional time examining each mechanism in detail. When Hayes questioned this, Sarah responded, "I wanted to understand, so I could build one if I needed to." This disturbed Hayes profoundly. If Sarah had spent years learning how restraints, locks, and security systems worked, she had essentially been receiving an education in exactly the skills that would make her most dangerous. By spring 1854, Hayes noted Sarah had become more communicative, engaging in conversations that exceed minimal necessary responses. She began asking questions about his research, about medical principles, about anatomy and physiology, particularly about which points on the human body were most vulnerable to injury. Hayes realized too late that she was conducting her own research project, with myself as the unwitting subject. In August 1854, exactly 7 years after Riverton Hall, Hayes hosted 5 medical colleagues to observe his research subject. The demonstration included Doctors Pritchard, Lattimore, Constantine, Thornhill, and Mercer. When Hayes attempted to demonstrate Sarah's pain tolerance through deliberate infliction of suffering, several physicians objected strongly. The resulting argument created tension that ended the demonstration early. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Pritchard asked Sarah if she had been treated well. She responded with remarkable calm. Treatment, doctor, is relative to expectations. I expect nothing, and therefore I am never disappointed. The simple statement created profound silence. It was both acknowledgement of her awareness and implicit indictment of her circumstances. The next morning, Hayes arrived at his facility to find Sarah had escaped during the night. She had freed herself from restraints, exited multiple locked doors, and vanished. What she left behind was more disturbing than the escape itself. The opened cuffs with locking mechanisms intact but disabled. A detailed drawing of Hayes's facility layout showing room functions and guard routines, and a note in clear handwriting. The note read, "Dr. Hayes, I thank you for the education you provided, though not the education you intended. You taught me how the body fails and where it is vulnerable. You taught me how men think when they believe they are safe and in control. You taught me patience by testing mine. I have decided my lessons are complete. I am going north. If you pursue me, I will use what you taught me. If you let me go, you will never hear from me again. Choose wisely. Sarah." Hayes stood holding this note for several minutes before making a decision that would define his career. He did not immediately report the escape. Instead, he contacted Pritchard and Lattimore, seeking their advice. His reasoning was self-interested. Reporting would expose his questionable methods and damage his reputation. Moreover, he was genuinely terrified of what Sarah might do if pursued, given the anatomical knowledge he had inadvertently provided. The three physicians agreed to report the escape, but claim it resulted from simple security failure, omitting the note and circumstances suggesting Sarah's intelligence and planning. Local authorities were notified 2 days later. Despite substantial rewards and posted notices describing her distinctive appearance, no credible sightings emerged. A 7-foot-tall woman had simply vanished. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the mystery deepens. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark historical mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happened to Sarah after she disappeared into the night. In 1856, 2 years after her escape, mysterious occurrences began in a free black farming community in Chester County, Pennsylvania. Residents reported a tall figure moving through woods bordering their farms at night. Someone who moved with surprising silence despite her size, never threatening but always observing, as though studying the rhythms of free life from a careful distance. Then came more direct interactions. A replacement plow blade appeared at the Johnsons' farm the morning after theirs broke. Carpentry tools materialized at the Washingtons' workshop. Quality items always left where they would be found, never with explanation. On 3 occasions, barn fires were discovered and extinguished before major damage occurred, and witnesses reported seeing a tall figure walking away, not fleeing but moving with purpose, as though having completed necessary work. The community's leader, Isaiah Freeman, a blacksmith who owned his farm and workshop free and clear, began leaving written messages at locations where the figure had been seen. His notes expressed curiosity rather than hostility, offering welcome to someone who seemed to need help. For weeks, silence. Then, in October 1856, Freeman found a response written in charcoal on birch bark. "I mean no harm to your community. I am learning how free people live. I need to understand before I can join. I will remain at a distance until I know I will not bring danger to you. S." Freeman and other leaders discussed this message at length, puzzling over what danger the writer feared bringing. They crafted careful responses asking for direct meeting, for clarification. The messages produced no immediate response, but the observations continued. The tall figure appearing at edges of community gatherings, watching but never participating, like someone studying a language before attempting to speak it. Freeman's wife, Rachel, finally made the connection. Through Underground Railroad contacts, she had heard stories about an extraordinarily tall woman who had escaped from Georgia 2 years earlier, someone authorities still theoretically searched for. someone whose description matched their mysterious observer. Rachel and Isaiah crafted a new message acknowledging they understood the figure might be someone fleeing bondage and explicitly offering protection. This produced a response within days. On a November evening, the figure approached Freeman's workshop from the woods as darkness fell. Isaiah and Rachel both stood in the doorway as Sarah stepped into the lamplight, tall enough that she had to duck under the doorframe, her clothing rough and weathered from wilderness living, her body lean and powerful. But what struck them most was her eyes, intelligent, careful, like someone who had learned that every interaction might be a trap. "I'm the person from the Georgia Notices," Sarah said quietly, her voice softer than they expected from someone her size. "But I was held illegally at the time of my departure, and I killed no one during the escape itself. I've been living in the woods for 2 years, moving north, avoiding people whenever possible." Isaiah asked why she hadn't sought help from Underground Railroad operators or abolitionist communities. Sarah's response revealed the depth of her wariness. "I learned in bondage that people who claim to want to help me usually want to use me for their own purposes. I needed to be certain your community was different before I trusted my freedom to anyone." Over the following weeks, a tentative relationship developed. Sarah worked at the Freeman farm, primarily at night or early morning, helping with heavy tasks, moving equipment, breaking ground for spring planting, repairing barn structures. She lived in a small shed at the wood's edge rather than in the main house, clearly uncomfortable with enclosed spaces and proximity to others. She spoke little and avoided everyone beyond the Freemans themselves, watching and listening more than participating. Rachel Freeman took particular interest in helping Sarah adjust. She brought meals to the shed, sat with Sarah during evening hours, asked gentle questions that didn't demand answers. Slowly, fragments of Sarah's story emerged. Her childhood in Virginia, sold away from her mother at age 11. The years moving among labor sites, always valued for strength, but always suspected. And Riverton Hall, Sarah spoke of it only once, briefly. "They were doing things that would have killed me eventually. I decided if death was coming either way, I would choose the version where I survived." She spoke more about Dr. Hayes's facility, explaining how she had gradually realized his experiments were teaching her valuable anatomical knowledge, even as they were designed to extract information from her. "He thought he was studying me," Sarah told Rachel during one evening conversation, "but I was studying him back, learning how bodies work, where they're weak, how to disable someone efficiently. I figured if I was going to escape, I needed to know these things. He gave me the education I needed to be free." This revelation disturbed the Freemans. They realized they were sheltering someone with both the physical capability and technical knowledge to be genuinely dangerous. They discussed whether to ask her to leave, weighing their commitment to helping escaped people against responsibility to protect their community. Finally, they decided to have a frank conversation with Sarah about their concerns. When they raised the issue, Sarah's response surprised them. She sat silent for a long moment, then said, "I understand your fears. They're reasonable. I learned violence as a survival tool, and I'm good at it. But I don't want violence to define me anymore. I want to learn how to live without it, how to exist in a community without being either victim or threat. That's why I watched your community for months before approaching, to learn if such a life was even possible." She paused, looking at her hands, those large, powerful hands that had killed 4 men and broken chains and built a life in wilderness. "In the woods, I was free but alone. I survived, but I wasn't living. I want to learn how to do both, to be free and to live among people. That's what I'm asking you to teach me." This conversation marked a turning point. Sarah began appearing during daylight hours, helping with community construction projects where her exceptional strength made tasks easier that would normally require complex equipment or many workers. She attended evening gatherings at the Freeman home, sitting quietly and listening to conversations about crops, weather, local politics, the small dramas of community life. She began learning to read and write more formally. She had picked up basic literacy over the years, but had never had systematic instruction. Rachel Freeman became her teacher, and Sarah proved a dedicated student, practicing letters by lamplight in her shed until late each night. Children in the community, less burdened by adult fears and assumptions, approached Sarah with natural curiosity. They asked direct questions about her height, about where she came from, about what it was like to be so tall. Sarah answered them honestly but simply, and soon several children began visiting her shed in the evenings, watching her work on carpentry projects or asking her to lift heavy objects just to see her do it. The adults noticed that Sarah was most relaxed around the children, that something in her guarded expression softened when a child asked her to help retrieve a ball from a high branch or to show them how to use a hammer properly. By spring 1857, Sarah had become a visible if still somewhat mysterious member of the community. She had learned to navigate social interactions with more ease, though she remained quiet and preferred listening to speaking. She had begun helping at other farms beyond the Freemans, offering labor in exchange for learning different skills: coopering, leatherwork, weaving. She was, Isaiah Freeman noted in his journal, like someone building herself a complete education in how to be a free person, learning everything she was denied during bondage. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Sarah's past threatens to catch up with her. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. But this progress was threatened when news reached Chester County that a man claiming to be a slave hunter from South Carolina was making inquiries in nearby towns about an unusually tall woman living in the area. The description he provided matched Sarah closely enough that community leaders realized the search had never truly ended, that somewhere, someone still believed capturing her was worthwhile. The community faced a decision. Many urged Sarah to flee further north to Canada, where she would be beyond reach of American fugitive slave laws. But Sarah, in the first community meeting where she spoke publicly, argued for remaining. "I'm tired of running. I've spent 9 years in bondage and 3 years in the wilderness. I want to learn how to live as a free person in a community, and I can't do that if I'm constantly moving. If they come for me, they come. But I won't run anymore." Her words carried weight. The community had seen her transformation over the past months, had witnessed her determination to build a life rather than merely survive. Isaiah Freeman consulted with abolitionist lawyers in Philadelphia about Sarah's legal status. They confirmed she could theoretically be arrested under the Fugitive Slave Act, but noted several complicating factors. Her legal status had been ambiguous even before her escape. State property transferred to Hayes under questionable conditions. Nearly 10 years had passed since Riverton Hall, with witnesses dead or scattered and records lost. Most importantly, pursuing her case would reopen discussions about what had happened at Riverton Hall and in Hayes's facility, discussions that multiple powerful people had strong incentives to prevent. The community implemented a coordinated strategy. They documented Sarah's current life, gathering testimony from dozens of people about her peaceful integration and contributions. They prepared legal papers arguing that pursuing her would serve no legitimate purpose beyond perpetuating injustice. And they made it known through various channels that any attempt to take Sarah by force would meet with organized resistance. The slave hunter, Walter Pembroke, initially pressed forward with his investigation, confident that locating someone of Sarah's distinctive appearance would be straightforward. But he underestimated both the community's organization and the legal complications involved. When he attempted to obtain official warrants, he found himself entangled in bureaucratic requirements to demonstrate clear ownership. When he made informal inquiries, he encountered coordinated silence and active misdirection. After several weeks, Pembroke received instructions to abandon pursuit. Correspondence discovered years later suggested Dr. Hayes himself, contacted about providing ownership documentation, had advised against continued effort. Hayes had written that The subject in question has demonstrated remarkable capacity for resistance. The cost and risk of recapture likely exceed any potential value to be derived therefrom. Some battles are better left unfought. The immediate threat passed. Sarah remained in Chester County, and the community's successful resistance to Pembroke's efforts strengthened their collective identity and resolve. For Sarah, the experience provided something she had never known before: the feeling of being protected rather than merely tolerated, of being worth defending, of belonging to something larger than herself. The years that followed transformed Sarah in ways that went deeper than her external circumstances. She purchased 5 acres of land adjacent to the Freeman property with money earned from her labor, using skills learned from the community to build her own small cabin. She worked her land, grew her own food, and continued hiring out for projects requiring her exceptional strength. But more importantly, she began the slow, difficult work of learning to live without the constant vigilance that bondage had required. Rachel Freeman documented this transformation in her journal entries over the years. In 1858, she wrote, "Sarah is learning that not every sound means danger, that not every question is a trap." Last week she laughed at something Isaiah said, the first time I've heard her truly laugh, rather than just acknowledge humor. The sound was strange, as though she had to remember how, but it was real. By 1860, as the nation moved toward the Civil War that would finally destroy the institution that had defined Sarah's early life, she had built something that would have seemed impossible during her years at Riverton Hall. She attended community gatherings regularly, contributed to collective decisions, and had even begun teaching younger people practical skills: carpentry, blacksmithing, basic mechanics. The children who had first approached her with curiosity now sought her out for lessons, and Sarah proved a patient if demanding teacher. When war came, Sarah contributed to the Union cause in practical ways. She helped construct earthwork fortifications for Pennsylvania militia units, preparing to defend against potential Confederate incursions. She provided labor for military supply operations, using her strength to move materials that would normally require teams of men or horses. She donated food from her farm to support regiments passing through the region. But she refused all requests to speak publicly about her experiences or to allow herself to be used as a symbol in abolitionist propaganda. "I am not a story for other people to tell," she told one persistent journalist who had tracked her down, hoping for an inspiring tale of escape and triumph. "I'm a person trying to live a life. If my existence proves something about human capability or resilience, fine. But I won't perform my trauma for anyone's political purposes, no matter how righteous they believe their cause to be." After the war, as Reconstruction struggled forward and formerly enslaved people throughout the South attempted to build lives in freedom, some people who knew Sarah's story suggested she might pursue legal claims. Compensation for her years in bondage, perhaps, or formal acknowledgement of wrongs done to her. Sarah declined even to consider such efforts. Going back to that life, even to seek justice, would give it more power over my present than it deserves, she explained to Isaiah Freeman. "I prefer to live forward rather than looking back. The system that held me doesn't exist anymore. The men who abused me are dead or old. What would I gain by dredging up those years except more pain? I'd rather spend my energy building something good than fighting ghosts." But Sarah did speak occasionally about her experiences in carefully chosen contexts. She talked with other formerly enslaved people who struggled with the transition to freedom, sharing what she had learned about building a life after trauma. She advised young people in the community about patience, about the long work of healing, about choosing who you wanted to become rather than being defined by what had been done to you. In 1867, a young woman named Clara arrived in Chester County after escaping from Maryland. Clara was tall, not as tall as Sarah, but tall enough that she had been singled out for harsh treatment and constant surveillance during bondage. She arrived traumatized, unable to sleep in enclosed spaces, flinching at sudden movements, speaking only in whispers. The community brought her to Sarah. Over the following months, Sarah and Clara spent hours together. They worked side by side in Sarah's fields, Clara gradually learning that physical labor could be chosen rather than forced. They sat together in the evenings, Sarah talking quietly about her own journey from survival to living. Rachel Freeman noted in her journal that Sarah is teaching Clara what Sarah herself had to learn alone, that freedom is not just absence of chains, but presence of choice, and that learning to make choices after years of having none is its own kind of difficult work. Clara eventually built her own life in Chester County, establishing a small farm and becoming a valued member of the community. Years later, she would say that Sarah had saved her life, not through dramatic rescue, but through patient example of what was possible, through proof that someone could survive terrible things and still become whole. As Sarah moved through her 40s and into her 50s, she became an elder figure in the community, someone younger people sought out for advice, someone whose presence at community discussions carried weight, someone whose story was known but not defined by trauma. She remained physically impressive, her strength enduring well past the age when most people began to slow. She remained quiet, preferring action to words, but she had learned to exist openly, to accept help when offered, to allow herself to be cared about. In 1872, Rachel Freeman recorded a conversation that captured something essential about Sarah's journey. They had been discussing Sarah's past, a rare occurrence, as Sarah still spoke little about those years. Rachel asked whether Sarah ever regretted the violence at Riverton Hall, whether she was haunted by having killed 4 men. Sarah was quiet for a long moment before responding, "I don't regret what I did. Those men made their choices and I made mine. What haunts me isn't the violence itself, but how much of my life was consumed by simply surviving. I learned to read at 30. I learned real mathematics at 32. I discovered I enjoyed building things, creating rather than destroying, only after I escaped. How much of me was lost in those years when all my intelligence and strength were devoted just to enduring?" She looked at her hands. Older now, marked by decades of hard use but still powerful. "That's what I carry. Not guilt about the violence, but grief about what I might have been if I'd been free from the beginning. But then I remind myself that who I am now includes everything I survived to become. The lost years made me, even as they took from me. I contain both the loss and what I built from it." When Sarah died in January 1889 at approximately 65 years old, her passing marked the end of an era for Chester County's Black community. Her funeral was attended by more than 200 people, formerly enslaved people who had known her story and been inspired by it, children she had taught who were now adults with children of their own, neighbors who had worked alongside her for decades, and people who had traveled from other states specifically to pay respects to someone whose life had meant something beyond its individual circuit. Misstances. The community erected a simple stone marker at her grave, bearing her name and years of life, with one additional line, "She survived to live." No mention of her extraordinary height, no reference to Riverton Hall or the violence that had marked her years in bondage, no dramatic narrative of escape and triumph, just acknowledgement of the fundamental achievement of her life, that she had not merely survived terrible circumstances, but had learned to live fully beyond them. Isaiah Freeman, speaking at her funeral, said simply, "Sarah taught us that freedom is not given by the absence of chains, but earned through the daily choice to live openly, to risk connection, to build rather than merely survive." She showed us that healing is possible, even from the worst wounds, that transformation is real, that who we choose to become matters more than what was done to us. We are all better for having known her. In South Carolina, the Grayson plantation eventually disappeared entirely. The land subdivided and sold to multiple owners after decades of changing hands. The buildings where Sarah had been held fell into ruin, gradually reclaimed by the forest and swamp. No historical marker was ever placed there. Local historians occasionally noted the property's history in academic papers, but the details remained obscured behind euphemistic language about labor difficulties and management challenges. Dr. Hayes's research papers, published posthumously by his daughter in 1876, generated brief controversy in medical circles before fading into obscurity. Some praised the comprehensive documentation, while others condemned the ethics of his methods. The debate eventually died as other research directions emerged. But Hayes's name remained tainted by association with questions he had preferred to avoid about the cost of knowledge gained through exploitation. The 4 overseers who died at Riverton Hall, Finch, Huxley, Crenshaw, and Vernon, gradually disappeared from even local memory, their names surviving only on weathered gravestone markers in various Beaufort district cemeteries, with no indication of how they had died or what they had been doing on that August night in 1847. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there still secrets buried in those forgotten plantation records and destroyed journals? What do you imagine Sarah thought about during those 2 years alone in the wilderness, learning to live without chains, but not yet ready to live with others? Leave your comment below and let me know what stands out to you most about this case. If you found this story compelling and want to hear more forgotten histories from America's darkest chapters, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who appreciates stories that challenge our understanding of human endurance and resistance. And remember, history isn't just about the events that made it into official records. It's also about the people who lived through circumstances so terrible that the only way forward was to become something new entirely. See you in the next video.